Morning, sir.
Hey man,
Doing, brother.
um, let's see. I just need to get my ear pods in,
Yeah, you sound good.
and that'll help. Do you hear me,
Yeah, you sound good.
Jake?
Yeah, you sound really good.
Okay, I don't hear you in my ear pods, so give me a second to sort that out.
Sure.
Okay, speak again.
Folks, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. And my guest today is a legendary
Yeah,
guitar.
still okay. There, now I have you where you should be. Great,
Are you ready to go?
ready to go.
Folks, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show, capping off a pretty astounding week of interviews. And as we head into the Tucson Jazz Festival, it's always refreshing to connect with a cat who's been on the bandstand and in the studio from before I was born. Somebody who understands the need for human interaction and conversation when recording music, and also the ultimate conversation on the bandstand, which doesn't just serve to inspire the musicians, but can also raise the collective consciousness of the people in the room. And my guest was able to sing for his supper, playing music, and a lot to talk about. Jeff Mironov, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thanks, Jake. Happy to be here.
It's an honor. I wanted to talk. I don't know if you ever crossed paths with the great saxophone player Mel Martin. He was a West Coast cat, and he was, he played with a lot of heavy cats, and he was talking about in Sacramento going to see Les Brown's Band of Renown, and their horn player at the time, I mean, the whole band was acoustic. There was no amplification. And the horn player in the band was able to fill the room. He was able to fill the room completely with his sound. And a lot of the old school masters of music were able to do that. Whether you were horn players or guitar players, not just projection, but the entire encompassing uh, all that entails of sound. And I kind of wanted you to go back earlier in your life, when you kind of learned or had to rely on physicality and soul and not amplification in order to generate sonically.
Well, that's a great reference. I didn't know of him. That's a name that, one of the many names undoubtedly that
It's
I never
okay.
really.
He's great, but yeah.
Um, Certainly what you're describing is that fundamental essence and necessity for communication of any kind to occur, certainly in the musical world. Um, that's a huge part of it, the whole the ideology of tone and the need or the desire or the wanting to produce a good tone. I mean, ultimately, as a young musician, you're attracted to a sound, and that sound somehow speaks to you and gets through the veneer, gets under your skin, so to speak, and if you really get connected to it at an early age, which you fall in love with the whole feeling of that thing, and it's not any one thing in particular. It's expansive and it's welcoming and it rings a bell unlike any other. And then you're smitten with it and you spend the rest of your life trying to fulfill that affair, that love affair,
Right. Right. You,
And
yeah, no,
certainly
yeah.
early on, although my era was, my first uh, real connection with music was that rock and roll thump, that thing that used to roll out of the nightclubs on the boardwalk in New Jersey when, as a kid, we'd be walking on the boardwalk with my parents and the door would open and you could feel you know, this this thing that the 60s had, the late 50s and the 60s had, which was just such a powerful sound and it was so engulfing and it was all about how do I do that? How can I do that as quickly as possible? And what do I need to do it?
What was the, this is so fascinating because I remember, I forget who I talked to, might have been Steve Swallow or something like that. But you go back and listen to Coleman Hawkins on record. And, even before that, I mean, the sounds of, could have been urban centers or New Jersey or Philly. I mean, there was a quietness. The sonic nature of society, the din of society was not that loud. And that came across in the music as well. And what you're describing is sort of this frequency elevation of rock and roll. And you're basically describing it as something where you could walk out your front door and feel that frequency. You could feel things bubbling up because, I mean, that was a time when, let's face it, I mean, drums went from this is fascinating, and I want to get your feedback on this, is because you know, drums specifically, when you listen to Joe Morello or you listen to cats, uh, from the early 60s, late 50s, the recordings of those times, the drums are merely an accompanist instrument. I mean, they're part of the conversation. And then right when Mironov is starting to kick the tires and get going on his career, you had these really, really bombastic, loud, but dynamic rock groups, King Crimson or Deep Purple, and all of a sudden, the drums became, I mean, at least in recorded music, very much at the forefront, which increased the sonic nature of everybody. Everybody had to get louder. And at that time when it was new, it was fascinating. But then you project and go forward, and by the '80s, I mean, you talk to cats, it just started a lot of bass drums. They started to sound like machine gun fire. But that early '70s period, late '60s period, I mean, can you talk about the role in your ears of the drums? Not necessarily with psychedelic music, but even pop music of the day, and how it was really more an accompanist instrument as far as the soundscape is concerned.
Well, essentially, music is a primal thing. I mean, we could abstract that and say that life is a primal thing. It's all about that deeper rhythm thing, that deeper feeling, that deeper connection to everything in the world and what's beyond the world. And
Yes, yes.
that speaks in so many ways. It's audible within the human circuitry of audibility, but it's also felt at a deeper level because that soulful nature that we all share is beyond the range of the body. It's a much more receptive connect part of that creative thing, that mojo, so to speak, that universal mojo. And primarily from a human perspective, I mean, we're a tribal culture.
They called it Santeria, even though that's a Latin word. We're talking about diaspora and all the tribes from Africa that came over, and that people use that word tribal today in a political sense, trying to keep some sort of um, you know it's used in a different kind of fashion. To me, the word you're talking about in terms of this universal soul is accessing the primordial gut. And I think that,
Yeah,
like, yeah, and I just, like we could wax poetic on that history, but I want to know when Brother Mironov, especially early on, before you were a name in the studio, and just overall, how you learned to go from your head to your heart into the primordial gut when you were playing.
Well, that there was never a substitute for that, and there never will be.
Yeah,
And to the degree that that orientation, that deeper sense of self, having to do with what's beyond the intellect and beyond the mind that thinks about things and thinks in terms of things and intellectualizing and categorizing, that's part of the human evolution, but it certainly isn't everything. And ultimately, the music makers, the real movers and shakers of the world, were grounded in that gut thing, in that feeling it thing, in that this is what I mean thing.
exactly.
And for me, that was certainly a growth process because um, I wasn't initially consciously aware of that identity, that deeper feeling thing. I felt things for sure, but I also had a developed enough intellect which worked for me, where I kind of trained myself to favor thinking about things. And how that manifested musically was initially, um, I wasn't sure about that thing called who I was as a creator, as a voice, in that you know that majesty of musical uh, development and personality, and how all those apparent separate parts fit together in a very unique and original and authentic way. And I had acquired, unfortunately, some some doubts about that, and that made my music making initially more heady than it needed to be. And so I quickly I really had to learn how to let that stuff go, and rely on that deeper element. And it was a process for me because I wasn't so sure about all that. But the process itself over time relieved me of the burden of having to think about anything.
I was going to say, I mean, this is what was so magical about your generation of musicians is that for the most part, all the original masters of music were not just alive, they were still touring. I remember Al Gaffa, the great studio player, played with Dizzy. I mean, he was walking down the street with his guitar, and Wes Montgomery stopped him and shook his hand and talked to him for 5 minutes. I mean, it's this idea that musicians are healers, and it's easy to be with your peers and get heady about stuff. And I just wonder if there was an elder. I mean, Pat Martino had Les Paul and other people, Dennis Sandoli, and all these cats had their elders who said to them, or at least just played for them, and said, "Hey, play what you feel, but play from your gut and burn." And I just wonder if there was somebody in a practical setting, in an application setting, where you learned that maybe you didn't need to use so much language and that less is more because you were able to get your life force across with what you were trying to say.
Well, it was cumulative, and everyone played a part in the development of that really simple
sense of self. I also studied with Dennis Sandoli, and certainly, at a later stage of my musical training, um, I think I was in my early 20s, maybe around 20. I studied with him for about 8 months, and he was certainly a part of that. His thing was he knew everybody had a voice, and there was no exception to that.
Wow.
And he saw that his skill and his role as a teacher was to provide you with a way to get to that. It wasn't the only way, but it was a methodology that he and his brother Adolf, really developed and excelled in. And he used to say he asked everybody for a minimum of 4 hours of practice every day, and that was so he could be assured he would at least get 1 hour of uninterrupted involvement, immersement, because he knew how distracted we were initially at early stages of that development, and how profoundly essential it is to have um, that focus, that focus of attention and concentration, and the ability to and the trust to be able to allow yourself to be swept away by it for a 40-minute set, or if you were practice whatever your practice period was. I mean, that's a key quality in expressing that deeper thing,
Right.
is acquiring that feeling for I can do this, and all I have to do is just do this. And what that do this means is whatever that is for the individual, where you need to develop that. If you don't develop that, nobody's going to be effectively moved enough to want to keep playing with you or keep asking you to come back and play again. You have to, you know, there's a beautiful Errol Garner story, the great jazz
Yeah,
pianist,
yeah,
where
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in an interview they asked him if he ever felt insecure, or perhaps had the thought that if he knew how to read music, he would have been more self-expressive, maybe a better performer. And he said to the interviewer, "Ain't nobody listened to you read.
Ain't nobody listen
They
to your reading?
Yeah, they
Oh, I
don't
love it.
listen
Yeah,
to
I
you
love it.
read.
I
They
love it.
listen to you. They listen to you play. They
Right,
feel you.
right, right.
And if that's not the first thing that other feels when you reach your hand across to shake somebody's hand, they're not going to feel all that comfortable with you. People have to know you're glad to be there with them for that exchange.
You
And
know,
he knew that. And he knew that profoundly and powerfully and joyfully, and that he expressed that so cleanly and clearly and effusively in his playing. I mean, his joy just knocked your socks off.
knocked your side. I love that. I've been using that line every day. I curious about, it's so interesting, man, because just did this interview this week with I don't know if this name's going to register with you, Jack Peterson. But
No,
Jack is 93 years old in Jacksonville. He's still eating cheeseburgers, and he was discovered by the head of Berkeley at a Stan Kenton music camp in 62, and was offered the opportunity to develop the first guitar curriculum for Berkeley. And now we're
yeah,
talking like, I mean, he had Abercrombie in his class and Mick Goodrick and all these other, but I mean, we're talking no rule book, no roadmap. And, it was, he had to get the Harvard book of literary terms, and so he was on top of just being a blazing Texas, guy. He was actually from Denton, but I just with Sandoli going back, you were not inculcated in this street music of blues and jazz and rock. It wasn't being taught in a codified manner in the academy. And to me, because now every institution has a music school, they have a jazz school. Everybody has literature out there. There's books everywhere. We are so much more visual now, as Errol Gardner said, so much more visual than autodidact now. And I just wondered on a granular level, you could talk about how an example of how Sandoli helped you draw out that individual sound. Because my argument is, I just in jazz today, whatever that word means, part of it's the recording techniques, but there's a homogenization of sound. Going back to the '60s, you put on a record, you knew if it was Mickey Roker or Pete LaRocca or Max Roach or Tony Williams or this, that. Same with horn players. You knew their sound. And now I can't tell who anybody is anymore. And that speaks to the fact that there's this assembly line thing going on in the academy, which you were really not tainted by. So I was wondering if you could talk about how Sandoli helped, or an example of how, at a granular level, how he helped draw out your voice.
He really listened. He really knew how to listen.
Deep listening.
Yeah, and he heard you before you heard you.
Wow.
And that was also a part of his gift, of his very, very unique role as a teacher. I mean, he essentially, he was a lover of that beautiful, voicing called originality and authenticness. And he was so zoned into that. And everything about he had a weekly outline. Actually, it was a monthly outline. Each month had an idea, and that idea went through four weekly cycles of development in this system that he had. And he just knew somehow that system evolved out of his recognition, his knowledge that he knew there was validity everywhere. And if you were willing to do your due diligence, you'd get to it. And his whole system, his monthly outline and the way he worked with the students was to inspire you to get to that by doing what he asked you to do, because he knew it would work. And essentially it was all on you. You had to put the time in. And he knew if you just sat there and had a substantial enough focal point, which is what the form of his lessons were, you would ultimately, through that portal, that vehicle, that idea, you would get to the surrounding content that was uniquely yours. Wow. If you just sat there with your guitar and kept doing it, if you just kept doing it, he knew it would work. And the lessons were unbelievable. They were like 15 minutes maximum.
Can you talk? Because that's the way Mark Levine, the great pianist, rest in peace, and bone player, he wasn't even at Berklee in the late 60s. And he would go to Jackie Byers' house, and Jackie would play drums, and Mark would play piano. And he was just starting out, and Jackie would say, all right, let's play Cherokee in all 12 keys. And they'd get to, E or G or whatever, and Mark would fall apart, and Jackie would say, okay, well, now you know what you need to work on. We'll see you next week. It was 10 minutes. Yeah, I mean, it was so non-intellectual. I mean, it was about the forever journey of searching for your sound.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
music is, man. And today, I mean, you use the word distracted as a younger cat. Now, I think of today and the attention spans of younger musicians, that's distraction. I feel like you guys, even though you maybe didn't know it, were in a bath of meditation just because the mediums were records and radio and 4 hours of Sandoli teach. I mean, it wasn't, you weren't overstimulated except for frequency, vibration, and the fact that there were opportunities to make money playing music. I mean, so I mean, maybe you were distracted by girls, maybe you were distracted by, I don't know.
Anything.
Right. I mean, but it was just less. It was just, I mean, the dedication to the searching for the sonic interest was palpable.
Well, the every we generate our human experience that way. We're thing oriented. We're fascinated with things. We look for solution in things, and it's easy to become preoccupied with that view of
Hmm.
things, and all it is a point of view. But I think the indwelling, underlying preemptive reality of what it means to be alive is that primordial fundamental frequency of aliveness, and that will always be in the circuitry of the here and now, and ultimately our recognition of it, relationship with it, then becomes the directive passion in our life and in our living, or it doesn't, because we're favoring the intellect in its quest for, thing oriented solution.
Right,
And,
right.
and all of that's temporary too. I mean, ultimately, everything in the human experience ultimately has to return and does return to that fundamental feeling of having to feel it. And there's an unspoken, unspeakable element to it which communicates perfectly, and every living thing knows it and has its place within that hierarchy. And how long it takes us as human beings to get to that, to recover that sense of connection and the all-inclusive nature of it, that's the art of life and the art of living. But ultimately, the guys that I came up with and played with demonstrated that one way or another for me. Enough of that where it was unmistakable. It was in your face every day. When you sat down next to a guy like John Tropez or Dave Spinoza or Eric Gale or
Oh,
Hugh McCracken or Kenny Escher or, any of these cats who were already on the scene, they were already playing, they were my mentors, they quickly would play their shit. You'd hear it and feel it.
right. I love that. 15 seconds, you can feel it, right away.
Well, all of that, there was an element of competitiveness to the gig. And everybody, the people that endured in that environment were the people who, one way or another, really were trying. They really meant it. They wanted to be there. They felt they weren't faking it. They were connected to it in some way. They just had to be there. And you could hear that in the ideas that they played. Now, very often when you were reading a chart or interpreting a chart or, just sort of doing the thing, the job at hand, that what the part that each of us played was more restricted or more limited or more a part
Sure,
of an
of
arrangement.
course.
But in the breaks, in between the takes, everybody would more or less cut loose and
Dude,
get.
this is magic. Are you kidding? I mean, I'm surprised. I'm shocked but not surprised to hear that. I figured, yeah. I mean, that's when I
Oh,
interviewed.
it
Yeah.
would come unhinged musically often. Because very often you as a reader, you're reading the arrangement, you're doing the thing that the arrangement is more or less directing you to do, and you might like it or not like it so much. You might wish it was more one way or less a certain way, and that would build tension. And
Hmm.
when the take was over, the way that tension was relieved, you just play what you really felt. Your sonic wish and desire that it be more this way. And very often a producer or an arranger would come up to you and say, forget this shit on the paper, play that.
That's what I'm saying.
Play
And then that was the other magical part of it. Uh, you know, and we got so
more of
much going
that.
on. I have to. I'm just going to throw out some names here because I tend to just do very almost a contour sketch of my guest. I don't do a lot of heavy research in order for the idea for these spontaneous vignettes to verbal vignettes to occur. And last night I was just thinking about these cats that I feel like you were in that relative milieu and a little bit on the younger side than these guys, but I really felt deeply that being a Jersey cat, I'm a Long Island cat. I mean, I grew up in Stony Brook, but being a Jersey cat, I was just wondering how early on you were aware or connected with Barry Miles and or Al Di Meola.
It's an interesting. That's a good question. Well, let's see.
Only
Barry,
reason I say that is because Barry Miles, as you know, was a prodigy
yeah,
and he
yeah,
was burning up the gigs with a 13-year-old Demiola down in the West Village way back when. And I'm just like,
absolutely.
and I'm like, Mironov. And then I saw you were in those crazy Magic Theater records with Silverlight, my brother. I'm like, who the hell is Mironov? So I'm like, they must have crossed paths early, but maybe, I'm just going out on a limb here, but you can riff away on that.
Well, let's see. Certainly, Al Di Meola came into my awareness. I think it had to be by the late '70s. My initial calling was the Beatles and the
Oh,
Beach
sure,
Boys,
sure.
and through them getting connected to some of the earlier blues things, and then Cream, and it was the rock and roll thing. That's the thing that got to me. It was the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights, and but at the same time, I was powerfully attracted to that jazz thing, the Wes Montgomery and the Kenny Burrell and all of, that ilk of players. And it was a very different thing. And both of those influences have always been strong, uh, you know, deeply appreciated and felt uh, parts of my musical experience. And the Barry Miles thing somehow happened fairly early on, actually, I would say, because Barry actually called me for an audition to audition for his band. It might have been before Al Di Meola. Now, at that stage of my musical development, I was not ready or prepared or developed enough to be able to um, really feel comfortable in that environment.
Yeah, well, that's a
That
very, very angular environment, but that's amazing. Was it for a live band? It wasn't a studio date, was it?
No, I don't think so. I think
Yeah,
it was for his band,
yeah, yeah,
performance.
yeah.
He somehow my name had cycled around, and and uh, and I think all of that was before I actually started working with Barry in the studios. In the studio scene, on a lot of Tony Camillo dates. Tony Camillo, Anthony Camillo.
I can't believe you
Um,
just brought up that dude's name. Dude, I cannot believe you just brought up his name. He did this album, I believe you're on it, called Dynamite. I mean, it is
oh yeah, yeah.
unreal, dude.
That was a huge hit
Can
record.
you please talk about that, Cat? Because if I'm correct, he left this planet because that dude was a
Yeah, yeah.
stone genius. Dude.
Well, um, early on, this goes back. Wow, this was I must have been around 16 or 17. I didn't even have my driver's license yet. I had a car, but I didn't have my license yet.
Right.
And trying to think of how the thing developed. I had a drummer friend, a drummer whose name was John Malia from Central Jersey,
Wow.
and I actually studied guitar early on with his uncle Lou Malia. But it turned out that I played in a number of early bands, formative bands with John Malia. He was a great drummer, great guy, and he was going to a really small music school in Central Jersey called Alma White.
Wow.
And Tony Camillo was head of the music department, and it was a very
Oh my
small
God. This is making my day, man. This is unreal.
yeah, he was it was a very small musical department, and that suited Tony well because Tony was trying to get into the recording business. he
Absolutely.
he, he loved jazz, and he had that vocabulary, and he played bass, and he had had a master's degree, I think, by that time in music, and he was already an active arranger and writer and um, composer, I think, as well. And oh, it's okay, Ralph, no worries. And so so now, if you can
No, I
dig
got you
this,
going. I got you going. But no, so Malia
no,
and
check
yeah,
this out.
yeah,
Tony
dig.
Camillo at that
Yeah.
time had already connected with a young whippersnapper genius, budding, wonder child by the name of Tony Bongiovi, who Tony Bongiovi
Yes, I know.
became.
Yes.
Yeah, he also cousin of John Bon Jovi, became a music producer. He opened up the Power Station in New York. He was head engineer
Absolutely.
of Media Sound on 57th, which was one of the big studios in the city. And John Malia, Tony Camillo asked John Malia if he had any friends who would want to get together in a recording environment and play some of his arrangements. Tony was trying to learn and get feedback from more rock and roll blues oriented musicians. He was trying to get direct feedback from them to determine what he needed to learn and understand to be a more contemporary uh, composer,
Absolutely.
arranger,
Absolutely.
producer.
You,
And
yeah,
so
spot on.
Tony Bongiovi had a small little uh, 2-track recording studio in the basement of his father's mortuary. His father was
I
a
mean, that is
mortician.
insanity, dude.
Oh, and on weekends we would go to the
Oh
studio
my God.
and we would play Tony Camillo's arrangements, and he would ask us about them, and we would do our best to try to enlighten him and educate him, and that relationship developed. A year or two later, 2 or 3 years later, I went in the Army Reserves, and I was effectively unavailable musically for about a year and a half. And when I got out, I called him, Tony, because he was someone I knew, and I asked him what was happening. And at that point, he was already very active in the recording scene. He had already had a number of hit records. He was developing quite a name for himself as a producer and an arranger and a songwriter. And he invited me to come into New York and sit in, just listen to one of his recording sessions. He was already established in the New York community. And I went in and had, just a revolutionary experience. It was that, electrifying, riveting experience of knowing that's what I wanted to do. And I can tell you on the bandstand that Rick Marotta was the drummer. He
Oh yeah.
certainly became a profoundly well-known, influential groove meister on the scene. John Tropez was playing guitar. Another phenomenal guitar player was Jerry Friedman.
My hero,
Pat,
dude. Played with Tim
yeah,
Buckley a lot, dude.
Pat Rebelo was the
I
keyboard
did a
player.
sick interview with Revelo. That man is a sublime Zen genius, dude. These
Yeah,
cats, they're all my heroes. This is
yeah.
this is did you I'm just curious about Mironov on the hunt. Were you you were of age where you could have taken the train in. Were you part of that? There was this incredible burgeoning crossover blues rock scene going on in Cafe a Go-Go. You had Richie Havens, you had Mike Mineri playing vibes with a whammy with a wah pedal. You had the Blues Project. Did you find yourself down there checking out some of that extension of musical growth down there?
Not really. In those days, to me, when I went out to hear music, I'd go hear Bill Evans' trio at the
I
top of the
have.
gate. That
I'm sorry.
was the
Where?
thing.
And where?
Top of the
Top
gate.
of the gate. Wow, you were really, dude. You were seeing Motion and Chuck Israels and
No, at that point, it was uh, Eddie Gomez,
oh my
and
God,
it
Marty
it was
Morell. Yeah,
Marty Morell. Yeah, yeah.
dude, that is so. Tell me what, dude. This is magical because that music is acoustic psychedelia. Because you could, I mean, you go back to the LaFaro Motion stuff from the
Yeah,
Vanguard.
yeah.
I listen to that. I can listen to that every day. Side A, side B. It
Well,
sounds
it's
different.
timeless.
It sounds different every time.
Yeah.
They
Well,
never. I
that's
want
the
you. This is the concept.
nature.
This is what I want you to riff on because what you saw, what you were digging on. I want this concept. Now, again, in the studio, it's different. But I just want you to talk about this concept of never playing the same song the same way once.
Well, that sort of goes with the territory, right? The more
Yeah.
the more you get swept, the more instances and moments you have of being swept away by that inner feeling directive thing that's uniquely your own, the less control, the more control you give up,
Hmm.
which means there's always going to be new content, new information. And that results in you never play it the same way. It's
Ever.
just,
I mean, it's
yeah.
magical, man. It's like,
Well,
listen, yeah.
that's the nature of, that's the fundamental. That's aliveness. That's life. not all that other bullshit we think about,
Exactly, dude.
and all that brain heavy stuff that contains and limits and suggests and literally deprives you of that one and only moment of your how sweet it is soul. and
Dude,
and
Smokey
that's
Robinson,
that's
dude. Yeah, no, I get it.
that's the only part of you that has any ability to satisfy and fulfill. And certainly you learn that as if you're going to be successful with a guitar or as a drummer or as with a bass or as a horn player. That's the thing that you have to succumb to, accept, get out of the way of as soon as possible. And any lag or any interference in that just produces ho hum. Yeah, you have talent, you have ability, but I'm not feeling it yet.
Right. Yeah. It's just sort of just it's kind of I have to be
It's
honest.
empty.
Did you the All Music Guide suggests not always accurate. Mironov showing up on Roberta Flack Donny Hathaway session in 72, but I want to know, were you part of what was your first jingle studio date in New York?
Jingle date?
I'm just saying that because you went to see Camille, Tony, you saw this band. Obviously, things started to move after that. I'm just curious the first studio date you were on.
Well, I can remember doing a date for Bob Crew at a studio called Apostolic Sound.
Oh my,
Tony
yes.
Tony Camillo was the arranger of that date, and I was by no means, um, established, or I had nobody knew who I was at all, and it that somehow Tony Camillo. This was at that stage and at that time when Tony was trying to gain a foothold, get some notoriety. And he brought me in with a wonderful good jazz guitar player who I studied with before I went to Sandoli, was Harry Leahy. I don't know if you know that name.
No, dude, that's a name I have never heard.
Yeah, Harry Leahy was a brilliant jazz player,
Wow.
phenomenal teacher. He was beloved by everyone. He was just the sweetest heart and
Was he just a
most
local? Was he like at a
Plainfield, New Jersey.
dude? Jersey was just a factory of. It was a bastion of jazzers out there, man.
Yeah, it was close to the city. And anyway, so we all got, Tony called us in to do this session, and in comes Bob Crew, and I think
Right.
with Frankie Valli at the time.
That's right.
And
The
to
Bob
check
Crew
us out,
generation. Yeah, I did.
to
Yeah.
check us out. I mean, I can't remember, I don't care. I don't have any sense of whether we made any impression on him whatsoever. But that was that. And before that, now, the question that you're asking really is dredging up a lot of these older memories.
Yeah.
I think I did some stuff even before that with a wonderful singer by the name of Frank Previtt from New Jersey.
Whoa.
He was from New Brunswick or East Brunswick. I played in a few bands with him. And Frank, um, Bobby Alessi is another name that comes up. I think Bobby
Yes.
Alessi was his name.
Yes.
Now, Bob, the there was a there were twin Alessi brothers who were pretty heavily on the scene here in New York. But this was probably of that family, but neither of those two guys. Who was, I can't remember the guy's first name, but Alessi was his last name. And they had this doo-wop group with Frank Previtt. And we went to some studio. I don't even remember where it is. I think it was in New York. to record a couple of tracks. And I remember doing that and loving that and thinking, wow, this is pretty cool. And and that was way before. At that point, I was still living in New Jersey. I really didn't know much about the New York scene. It just somehow was in my in them their old days,
Would you put that around 1970?
Yeah, could have been,
Yeah,
absolutely could have been
yeah.
before then, could have been a year after then, but I moved into New York in 75. So it had to be somewhere in that period of, say,
Interesting,
70
interesting.
to 74. By 74, I was already 1974, I think I played on my one of my first hit records. I played on a few hit records early on that really were tremendously helpful and that gained a lot of momentum out there in that global environment and opened up a lot of doors. One was Glory. I think I can't quite get that name,
Yeah,
but
I'm gonna help. I'm gonna get it for you. I want to go back. This is really something fascinating. You're a little bit younger, but I've interviewed on the West Coast.
Back in that day, the
Yeah,
days we're talking about now, there used to be a club on 10th Avenue and 50, I think 51st or 52nd Street called the Guitar. That
really.
Kenny Burrell owned that club, and that was another major hangout.
I have never heard. See, Kenny's so modest. When I interviewed him, he never talked about that club. The place the place that was the when 52nd Street was really happening. Uh, and you were still in Jersey at the time. Was everybody was hanging at Jim and Andy's? You know Jim and
Yeah.
Andy's? Yeah,
Oh, totally. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
But here's the thing I wanted to ask you about because, like, I've done a bunch of interviews with Louis Shelton and a bunch of interviews with Dean Parks. And these guys came out to LA. Now, LA studio scene's a whole different animal, but when they got out there, you know, Howard Roberts was pretty wide open, but guys like Tedesco and a lot of those bebop cats that were studio stalwarts they hated rock music. And also a lot of the producers they'd say, play that swamp thing, play that, this was late 60s. So it was
Yeah.
Jimi Hendrix they didn't even know what to call it. And yet Parks and Shelton, just growing up in certain environments, obviously they had a jazz vocabulary, but they were steeped in rock and roll and R&B and stuff. So they assimilated naturally. And then pretty soon, a lot of these, stalwart what was known as the wrecking crew, a lot of those guys became obsolete. Um,
Yeah.
and I wonder about you. I mean, I'm thinking about Bertoncini, and I mean, obviously he
Yeah.
wasn't like
Gene Bertoncini,
Gene
sure.
Bertoncini, like
Sweetheart.
the best. I mean, dude, Parmesan cheese. The man is so legitimate. But a lot of these guys, I'm not so sure about. You mentioned guys like McCracken and Tropez. They were steeped in R&B. But do you feel like the previous generation of cats? One of the reasons you became a fixture in the studios was just because there was this transition of guys who were coming from a much older.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd love you to
It's
talk
that.
about that because I mean that to me was
It's
like revelatory. Ray Pullman was another Wrecking Crew guy that played with Hal Blaine, and nobody knows that cat's name, but the guy was like a country western R&B player. I mean, when funk and rock came in, it was like, what the hell is this? He couldn't do
Well,
it.
it's the same. It's the same thing. Every culture produces and gives rise to its own unique sound and its concepts and its musical ideology. And you have the community of people who are who love that. They're a part of that, and they're celebrating all that and bringing it forward, you know. And what often happens, and it certainly happens to all of us, once your mind fixes on something and you become identified with it, then you're maybe not listening as openly or as enthusiastically or with as much abandonment than you did before you knew how to do
That's right.
anything.
That's right.
And then you become, well, he's a bebop player. That's my thing. And ultimately, every new, you know, developed voice in the musical world in any of the styles, they're bringing that new thing that's happening right now that they're able more or less to do into circulation. And those who are more fixed in their orientation and more inclined to want to try to wrap it up or bottle it up or hold on to something, when you're clinging to anything, you're not really listening anymore. You're not absorbing. You're not as available creatively as you were before, you know, you decided that, you know, this is the idea I want to play, or the style I want to play, or this is who I am. I think, you know, the more evolutionary, revolutionary players in every style and in every generation are the ones that can't do that. They can't settle for any one way of doing anything. They're so driven by that deeper mojo, you know, that thing that is asks you only one thing: open your heart, shut your eyes, and let her rip.
Dude, no, you know what? That's what Larry Klein, the bass player, told me. He's like, I was always just a musical omnivore. You know, I devoured all kinds of music. And it's funny because as a journalist and a broadcaster, 14 years in, when I started my show, didn't really know what I was doing. But once I pivoted towards musicians and specifically cats that I loved listening to on record, you know, I started interviewing Richard Davis and Pat Martino and Dave Brubeck and Jack DeJohnette, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, "Oh, he's a jazz journalist." I'm like, "No, no, 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 no." And so I started to go after David Grisman and Peter Rowan and bluegrass, and you know, and rock and Zakir Hussain in world and Airto, and I did not want to be pigeonholed. I did not want to be branded. And
Nobody does.
nobody does, but ultimately,
Yeah.
if you're going to be able to sing for yourself, you know, at the end of the day, it's just also like a generational thing where I remember Chuck Israel saying it was just fascinating because this is your, even though you're very articulate and clearly made it through, you know, it's just interesting that popular music was dictated by adults in the 40s and the 50s. It was consumed and commodified by adults. Glenn Miller, you know, the list goes on and on. And then you got a million baby boomers coming in at 18, 19 years old, and all of a sudden the youth started to dictate what was popular music. And here
Well,
we are to
new
yeah.
life is new life, and it isn't going to be held back.
The problem with new life is, and with, this is going to have to go in. I mean, I'm having a ball, man. I mean, we're going to have to do set. When are you getting back to Hawaii?
I'll be back next Thursday.
So what is it's 9:30 here. How many hours earlier? I mean, how many hours earlier are you in Hawaii?
Hawaii right now is 5 hours earlier in the day than we are right now.
And what time do you like in the morning? What is your
I get up pretty early. I get up 5:30.
yeah, I don't blame you. It's Hawaii. Well, why don't listen, I got your you that number I called you, is that a landline or a cell phone?
It's my cell phone. The
So you
917 number is really the only active number I have right now.
so I'll text you and
Okay.
we'll set a time to do set two so we can continue this exploration of the primordial gut.
Oh, oh yeah, sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right on, man. It was a ball, man. I had it was just a fantastic set one, more to come.
For me too, Jake. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And great questions. And let's do it again.
All right, man. We'll be in touch. Be safe. I'll talk to you soon, man.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye bye.